It was interesting to hear you speak about Internet of Things and all the on-body and off-body and in-body sensors that are going to be coming. That isn't exactly what I will be talking about. I could have, and I hope we can pick that up with Neil and you and the rest in the discussion. What I'll talk about just was a riff off of the idea of neuroenvironments and uh, just an initial foray into what it means to live in a cognitive niche. So the topic really for me is why space is not just space, how the brain interprets space. So here's a American football field, and there is this virtual thing called a line of scrimmage, which all the players are lining up opposite. But of course, it's not actually there. So they are interpreting this, and they have this notion that they're imposing on here. All these lines have separate meaning on the field, and that's a highly rule-governed space. So the regions of this field are all laden with conceptual knowledge, and there are strategic places that have to do with their plays and so on. A game is a very rule-governed thing. Here we have some beautiful work by Rafik Anadol. And the point of that was just to see how once these images on the surface, moving images on the surface, they completely distort your sense of where you are. If you come and capture 3D space via 3D capture tool, you have a sense of what the 3D space is. The capture tool is going to represent it in terms of, in this case, NURBS, I would say, some kind of 3D graphic. So the way that the machine represents 3D space, there are many kinds of different representations of 3D space, different kinds of mathematics for it, and I'm not referring to the mathematics here, but these are the engineering methods that they have. Architects have some others with their parametric design tools, but perhaps in CAD. But you can get these very different kinds of representations of 3D space. Now that is what is how the machine can represent 3D space. Part of the question becomes is, how do humans, how does the brain represent 3D space? So here's the very simple thing. What do we mean when we say inside here? Is X inside or is it outside? What would it mean to say it's inside? So when you come and ask questions about how do humans represent space, you bump up against something quite obvious to ask anyway. Does our size, the nature of embodiment, does that matter to our conception of space? Do our capacities or our goals have an impact on space? Well, clearly, the theory of affordance tells us that size matters, and for this child, who is incapable of walking up the stairs in a climbing fashion, although he's crawling up, I guess. The stairs don't afford climbing. They afford this kind of climbing, but they don't afford walking. So space is represented relative to body size and to strengths and to skill. Size and abilities do matter to how the brain represents the space around it. How far something is depends on speed if you're in a car, and according to Gibson, how we measure distance when we're moving, locomoting, it's by time to impact. So there we're conceptualized, there's no intrinsic metric on space for a moving creature, more other than really the metric of when will I reach the side. So we're thinking more in terms of time to impact versus some more, I won't call it objective, but more extrinsic notion of spatial distance. The interests a person has, they matter too. In the classic New Yorker cartoon from the 70s, the distance is clearly subjective. How far something is or where something is depends on your interest set. And of course, again, can I get on a plane? When we come now to more sort of technical points about how the brain as a computational system relates to space, one of the more important collections of work, probably of the last 30 or 40 years, is that the brain has a clear notion of what is reachable by your hands on the end of your arms. That space is called the peripersonal space. Some people include in the peripersonal space the space that you can reach by kicking. So here is an idea of these different spaces. Here's peripersonal space for my arms. They're not including kicking here. This is outside of my immediate reach, but if I lean forward, I can reach it. So it's still it's treated as extrapersonal, but it still is nearby. And here is you've got to actually move your legs to get to the extrapersonal space that they're calling ambient here. The key thing is this reachable part, this peripersonal reachable part. So there is a lot of neural evidence for the robustness of the idea that we interpret the space that is within reach differently than the space that is outside of reach. And the reason is you, again, don't get an intrinsic metric on the space around you. Rather, to understand how far something is, how far is it? It's this far. So it's measured relative to your body, but how far is this far? So vision gets tuned through some associative cortex so that this far gets tuned to my distance, my visual distance of how far that is. That is the reachable distance. So your neural system gets tuned to what is reachable. There are special parts that are reachable, like peri-hand, there's peri-head, there's peri-neck, there's peri-torso. People have called lots of things for, lots of moving body parts have been defined reaching areas. It's a very multi-sensory notion, the peripersonal space. I talked about how far something is in virtue of what you can do to reach it. But there also is another reason why, another way that the body is sensitive to how far something is that can be reached, and that is through the sound. So it turns out that our auditory system is extremely sensitive to triangulating on the distance of things, but exactly how does it measure distance? Well, one thing is, can I hit it? So there is matching sound localization with reaching distance. And we're going to tie it to the visual neurons as well. So we're going to have it with vision, we're going to have it with haptics, and we're going to have it with audition. Proof that this is a robust area, that this peripersonal space is multisensory, is that there is a major change in the tactile sensitivity of your body when something like a bug enters into your peripersonal space. So yes, I could reach it or hit it. That's one thing, and my vision can help me with that. But also, my skin becomes hypersensitive. So I speed up my processing of tactile stimuli at the hand to give me faster judgments of whether something is touching me. And so you ask, when does that happen? And that happens when the creature just broaches the boundary of peripersonal space. So we can use our sensory detection, our scientific detection of when touch speed up occurs to identify the boundary of peripersonal space. Tools, too, change our representation of space. So a lot of fun research looks into how tools reshape our internal representation of our body boundaries. This concept has been called body schema. I think that Michael will be talking a little bit about body schema, so I'm not going to say anything about it. But the idea is superficially that we have a conception of where our body is, and that that conception can be distorted when we begin to practice using tools to extend our reach, for instance, or when we're used to walking on high heels, then our body schema adapts to include the extra height of the heels so that you don't hit hit something up that's you duck appropriately, and so here is a visualization of that. The hand, peri-hand space, sorry, peri-hand is here, but of course this wobble up here now would include your perihand sweeping like that. And if you include the whole arm, the whole peripersonal space now includes your reach, because now you can reach things. I'm not going into the variety of fun ways people have of having proven that the body schema representation gets distorted by tools, but there are things like getting people to practice using tool and then taking calipers and measuring how far, having them judge how far the calipers are apart here, and then using the same calipers and touching here and say, now, how far is that apart? And then saying, okay, it's this part, and then coming back to say, when is it equal? And then they show you that it's much farther apart over here than it is it's really here, but it internally represented as if it's being that far apart. So we get a notion that the body is beginning to represent our own body shape in a different way. The relevance, well, if we say that space is conceptualized and reacted to in an automatic manner, that depends on our conception of our body or our internal representation of our body, and we can distort our body, then the representation of space gets distorted in all sorts of ways. Now, the near future offers us a lot of exciting possibilities and certainly complexities for our understanding. We have in-body, on-body, near-body sensors. I've been at workshops with those very title, organized some, and with their actuators, near-body, on-body, in-body actuators. The stuff is coming. Everybody knows it. I teach a course, Cyborgs Now and in the Future, and we are already cyborgs, and it's happening again, accelerating just as history is accelerating. What exactly this is going to mean for our buildings when we can have tight digital coupling between ourselves and our buildings without using our body to touch it, that's another possibility that comes with the Internet of Things. I'm not going to talk about this now, but it is another way in which the conception of space will be changed because our interaction with space will change. Joint activity is a third way in which our conception of space changes. So when two people shake hands like this, there is a sharing of peripersonal space. When two people are working mediated by a large two-person saw to cut a log, exactly what is happening in the brain to represent that joint activity? And because the two-person saw is rigid, what exactly does that do to peripersonal space and the relationship between the two people and their conception of space? We understand now, I'm starting to, that we live in a social niche. When one animal is in a space and another conspecific enters the space, even way down, that animal's brain lights up. Maybe brains always light up if there is a creature of interest in the space, such as a predator or an ally. But humans light up for humans in a special sort of way. And when you look more closely, when they're close together, they not only have these joint activity spaces, but they share epistemic space. So epistemic space is common ground or what you think you know. And because you are with somebody close by, you assume that they know largely what you know about the things immediately around you. So you're both in the same situation. You both have similar situated knowledge, although, of course, with expertise, people have quite different understanding of that situated knowledge. So they have a shared experience, they're sharing emotions, they share values because they're so close together and perhaps culturally close, and they have this shared sensory motor engagement of space. So this social niche that people are in, how big is that social bubble? How can we alter it? What will technology do to that? So, and I mentioned how brains activate other brains here. They're actually looking at each other. Clearly, sharing gaze is going to be a huge impact on how two brains react. And even when you see somebody at a distance, that thing lights up when you see that they see you and you see that they see that you see them. Something special happens in the brain. All this alters what we think space is. So far, my summary is this. Space is not represented in the brain or in the mind or even in the body as a homogeneous metric structure. It's not measured in terms of feet or yards or inches or meters. Different people represent space differently. If you're big or little, you represent it differently because things are done relative to your own size. Think how a very tall person and their door, they think about that door very differently. Our capacities to do things in a space, hence the affordance that we see, affect what we see in that space, what we see as possible in that space, what we even understand the space to be. And our representation of space also depends on how we're moving. Relative to our speed I talked about, but there are other kinds of movements that matter, of course. Our interests or tasks, if we want to do something in a space, we're going to look at the space in terms of how we want to accomplish things, and there's a whole universe of interesting questions as to how we project structure onto that space because we're engaged in some activity. Tools in our hands or feet or any other part of our body, if we have exoskeletons, they change, again, our peripersonal space. And whether other people are in our space, that changes our conception too. The last thing I want to talk about is that we can be trained to think spatially. Obviously, the football players at the very beginning, when they're told about a football play, they are going to be thinking about the space in terms of how the players are supposed to follow the play in space and time. In the case of disaster response, which is a topic I worked on for 5 years, we studied how these first responders learn to conceptualize space. That was my interest. And the first thing you learn is that if there's a disaster such as a toxic release, say in a building, the first thing the first responders to the scene do, typically that's fire people, they'll come and they will sort of conceptually define a hot zone. They'll conceptually define a warm zone, but they'll also mark the boundary here that differentiates the cold zone, where people are thought to be safe, from the warm zone, where it's thought to be dangerous but not deadly, the hot zone, where you really have to have equipment to go in. And in this case, there's toxic release. So if you're going into the hot zone, be prepared for toxic fumes. And if you're going to go in there, you've got to have even more protection. They set the incident command center some point in the cold zone, some distance away. So now when these incident commanders and medical response team leaders come in, they know to conceptualize the physical space. They will ask questions like, is the hot zone shifting? Where's the plume right now? Are we in the shooter's line of sight? And those are the decisions, those are the factors they take into account when defining where the hot zone is. Then they also will think in terms of spatial terms about the response. Well, where are we going to bring in the ambulances? So they set up a transport area where they're going to bring people who are wounded over to the ambulances. They're going to have to clear that region, and then they're going to talk about where they're going to rendezvous. If they send some people in, they will talk about that inside. SWAT will talk about that. Where's the safe refuge area that we can bring people out and put them in this area? And then they're going to define all sorts of staging areas. So we found that they conceptualize, we distinguished an ontology of space. And these zones that I just, and those are also defined, taught in class, and they are marked by things like the staging areas where the firemen come and where hazmat comes. Each group has a place they have to go. And then there are stations where you take people through decontamination, and then you triage them, and then you put them into a treatment area. Either they need immediate treatment, or they are sort of intermediate wounded, or they are called walking wounded. There, you can let them go in an hour. And each one of these things are all taught, and everybody learns this. And then there are these ad hoc areas. You learn them, but you're not taught them so much. So if you were part of SWAT, SWAT knows how to clear a building or go into a building. They sometimes go back to back. They're walking back to back like this, looking in all different directions. And then they stop, and then the leader will point, and they will define a space, an ad hoc space, where they're trying to get to, or they're going to regroup or rendezvous spots. So sometimes there are external markers, but not always. And yet people are understanding the space like this in a terribly important way. Then there is something that has been referred to as professional vision. Professional vision is what happens when you learn to be an expert at something. And for instance, a mechanic has professional vision about a car engine. When a mechanic looks at a car engine, she or he sees the parts, sees how the parts are connected to others, see whether a part is damaged, worn, all sorts of things. They see it differently than somebody who hasn't got that expertise in assembly, disassembly, and repair. An architect, any one of you looking at this building, will look at it in a different way. Your scan path will be different. That is how you move your eyes over it. What you understand about the building, how you represent the building, all of that will be done differently because you have professional vision. And professional vision is an extreme version of the basic fact that people see things differently because they have different interests and they have different historical experience. It's unlikely that any two people will see this street, they'll scan it exactly the same way, though there are clear commonalities in how people see things. Here is an interesting simple study. They defined focal points. Here's one set. So this focal point was the person. In this other set, it was a person in water. They showed it to artists and non-artists. And these are the scan paths that their eye made as it was not tracking, just looking at the scene. So the non-artist fixated on the focal point, the point of the region of interest, the obvious region of interest, and they just did a little bit of situating that. And yet the non-artist just did a little bit of interest around the person, but was looking much more at the scene and somehow this person in the context. Similarly, you'd think that a region of interest like this would contract really the majority of attention. And yet, although it did for the non-artist, the artist, again, was looking at this. They were pictures. So the non-artist is scanning this and saying, oh, I see, look at the way the light is shimmering. Look at the red. I wonder how. They're not really dwelling on this. So here we have a clear case that different people look at scenes differently. And in this case, they look at them differently according to what they've been trained, whether to be visual or not visual experts, and artists and non-artists. We could do this for almost any skilled topic. So my upshot is, to human or animal brains, space is not homogeneous. It's represented differently, both according to the size of the creature and the speed that it's moving, but it's also represented differently for many other reasons. Our brains are wired to pay special attention to what's reachable, to the effects of tools in our hands or on our feet, and to the presence of other humans. And then through culture, we have learned to demarcate space into regions that have meaning. Don't go there. Be careful there. Meet you over there. Those are just a few examples, not nearly as complicated as the football players or as the disaster responders. Perhaps animals too have a clear notion of don't go there or meet you over there. I don't know. So through training and experience, we also learn to see and structure space in a professional manner. Lots of ways we see space, and this is just a tiny fraction. We didn't even talk about the neurophysiological studies of navigation and on the basis of what people make their way through a building. That's the end. I will stop my share.